Ex Cult. I was there for over 20 years. Actually, I was there continuously from when I was 21 till I was 42. So half of my life up until that point. Wendy was there for 7 years, and we finally left the group when we wanted to get married, and they didn't want us to. And we were both in our 40s, so we decided that was not okay.
We dated for 7 years.
And we had dated for 7 years. I'm a little like Jacob, who served for 7 years. So when he wrote a book about it, kind of
You get the right wife?
I did. I got the right wife. I was ahead of Jacob and them. Anyway, when we were coming out of this group, we had, we tried to reintegrate into mainstream Christian churches and had quite a hard time doing that. Some of the ministers and believers that we talked to didn't always do the right thing in terms of how to minister to us. So we thought we'd take our experience and show people kind of what not to do is really the emphasis, but how to minister to people who are coming out of cults and spiritually abusive groups.
And what we wanted to do first is ask how many of y'all have been involved in a cult? Okay.
Several.
Right here. And how many of y'all are seminary students? You see, I can see some seminary students in here. I'm a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary.
We're that tired, huh?
Yes.
To the twitching around.
So, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing for y'all to know is that even though I was raised as a Southern Baptist, and I went to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, I was not immune to becoming involved in a cult. So, we'll talk more about that later. Okay, ready to get started?
Yep. All right. We'll just start out with a simple definition of what spiritual abuse is. And I'd say, why don't we run through our PowerPoint presentation and then hopefully questions at the end. So kind of hold questions to the end. Spiritual abuse is the injury of a person's spiritual health by the misuse of their trust to gain or maintain control over them and to use them or their resources for the benefit of the leader of the group.
And for the purpose of this presentation, we are going to probably use cultic and spiritual abuse interchangeably. And now Paul Morton is here, so we're going to let him finish doing the I'm a little intimidated as Paul's here because he's been like my hero. I've read all of his materials and
Go Paul.
He helped a lot in our recovery. Some of the articles that he wrote was just tremendous. We're a little awestruck that you're here. Warning signs of potentially abusive groups.
All right. You're going to have control-oriented style of leadership, excessive authoritarianism, lack of accountability of the leadership. Individuality is perceived to be sinful and ridiculed. Leadership is excessively esteemed. The group has an elitist, superior view of itself. There's an overemphasis on commitment and loyalty to the group. And there's the use of intimidation or psychological manipulation. And I just want to add this comment, drop this in. This kind of thing does go on in Bible-based groups, and it goes on in Christian churches. I mean, there's nothing there that says anything about doctrine. Although, usually the doctrine is askew, but you could see that kind of thing going on in just about any Christian church.
And you think, well, leaders are supposed to be in control, and that's true. They are, but it's the excessive amount of authoritarianism. It's the excessive amount of control. As Doug mentioned, we were not allowed to be married. We couldn't get the blessing of our cult leader, even though we had dated for 7 years and we weren't, teenagers. So it's that kind of control that we're talking about. There's all kinds of cults, and we're going to run through this pretty quickly. There's religious cults, Bible-based cults, New Age cults, political cults, terrorist, psychotherapy, satanic, commercial cults. And when most people think of cults, they think of, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Hare Krishnas, People's Temple, Children of God, Scientology, the Moonies, Branch Davidians. And, you think of the David Korish's, the Branch Davidians. That was, we're from Texas, and this happened not too far from Dallas. And then you think of the Marshall Applewhites, Heaven's Gate out in California. The infamous Jim Jones with the People's Temple. And few people understand that there are, as Doug mentioned, Bible-based cults. The Trinity Foundation is the group that we were involved with. It is a Bible-based cult in Dallas, Texas. Ollie Anthony is the one that leads the group. Some of y'all may be familiar with this group because they are the ones that in the early 90s worked with Diane Sawyer and Primetime Live in exposing several explanations like Robert Tilton and W.B. Grant and Larry.
And they're very involved right now with Senator Charles Grassley and his investigation, the 6 televangelists that he's looking into. So Trinity is kind of behind the scenes there, feeding information to the Senate Finance Committee.
He's been written up in a lot of different newspapers, magazines, and newspapers like LA Times and U.S. News and World Report, the New Yorker.
He had a 10-page article, a 10-page long article about him in the New Yorker that read like a press release. I mean, he has gotten so much positive press because his expertise is in public relations. That's what he did before he became, leading a cult. And that's helped him a lot in his fights with the televangelists because he's just much more savvy at using the media than they are. And he's used that, he's leveraged it to get lots and lots of positive press for himself. And so until Wendy wrote her book, there really had not been anything negative to come out, about him. Go on in.
I'm just counting.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah. Well, the appeal, yes, Wendy and I were both believers before we got started in this group. So what was the appeal of a group like this? Well, we tried to recreate the experience of the first century Christians. So, there was some, romance to that vision. It was an opportunity to be a part of a unique and important mission.
we took in the homeless, we took in drug addicts, we were exposing the televangelists that were frauds. So, we were part of a very important mission.
You had instant caring, community, and friends. One of the people that we're friends with, who's also a former member, has referred to it as a lazy man's social haven. I mean, you had instant friendships there, and that was really nice. In the real world, you have to work your relationships and friendships, but you could land at Trinity Foundation, you had instant best friends.
Because we lived in a semi-communal fashion, most of the people, the majority of the people lived in a 2-block area in Old East Dallas. And we had our meals together. We had a communal dining area. We homeschooled the children. We had Bible studies every day and every night, just about.
Yeah.
We were in and out of each other's homes. So, that was, you always had somebody around you.
It was a place of belonging and acceptance instantly. You got, ironclad answers to the meaning of life. I remember Ole once saying he had all knowledge. So, that's pretty cool if you know somebody that knows everything. It's like having your own Google right there. Feeling of security. To have all the answers like that's great. I originally met Ole, I don't know if I'm supposed to tell this later or now, but I originally met him when I was 18 and a freshman in college, actually just before going off for my freshman year in college. And so, I was in that time of transition, really, truly looking for answers. And here I met somebody who claimed to have all the answers. That was pretty cool. Turned out he's wrong.
Took you 20 years to
Yeah.
figure that out. What is the control? Well, most cults, there's some isolation from former friends and family, because now the cult becomes your family. You know, your biological family, you know, they don't really understand you. Of course, they don't understand the doctrine. And so we are your family. The cult is your family now. There's special methods to heighten suggestibility and subservience. Powerful, powerful group pressures. In my book, I talk about hot seats. It's that what Robert Lifton talks about is the cultic confession, where you tell everything, and then people
Wail on you for a while.
yeah. So there's powerful group pressures to conform. There's a lot of information management. There's a suspension of individuality or critical judgment. In our particular group, and in many groups, they talk about letting go of your ego. Our particular groups taught that our mind is the Antichrist. And by the way, if any of y'all are planning to start a cult, this is like, you need to know this technique. You have to teach them not to trust their minds. So ours did it, you know, the mind is the Antichrist, you can't trust your mind. And anything that your mind tells you is wrong. And you had to empty yourself. We were told to die to self. That was one of the issues of scriptures. Also the critical judgment. People, when they're in a cult, they lose their critical judgment. They lose their those skills, because they begin shutting those down, because you're told you don't have to use that. You can, because your mind is the Antichrist. Then there's that promotion of total dependency on the group and the fear of leaving it. Doug, do you want to speak to that total dependency?
Well, yeah, because I was totally dependent. I think I was floating there for a second. I got triggered to that. Just thinking about the mind of the Antichrist. I couldn't think all of a sudden. But yeah, promotion of total dependency. The last 11 years that I was there, I worked full time for the group, and I made $80 a week. Didn't get a raise the whole time I was there. Probably should have gone up to 90. But they, I had room and board. I mean, I wasn't, starving or anything. So
You had to pay for your meals out of that $80.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you had to pay for your meals.
And of course you had to tithe on it.
And you had to tithe. So you weren't left over with a whole lot of money. So I thought several times. I mean, there were times, when doubts would start to bubble up a little bit. And I'd think about, maybe this is wrong, maybe I need to leave, maybe I can get out of it. But at that point in my life, I was so dependent on the group that really, if I were to leave, if I couldn't find somebody to let me sleep on their couch, I'd have just had to have gone to a homeless shelter. I mean, there was no, and so, there was, very much a sense of being trapped there. And so then, you start to rationalize about why it would be better to leave. The other thing that I was thinking about on the mind is the Antichrist when I had this one, because there's two things you really need. You need a way to, help people, suspend their critical judgment, and you need another thing, which is a thought-stopping technique. Trinity had a very good one of those. We were always to repeat, "It is finished," because those were the words of Christ on the cross. So anytime you started to have doubts about the doctrine or the group or anything, you trained yourself to say, no, these doubts are not right. It is finished. Everything that needs to be done has been accomplished by Christ, which is true theologically, but, as I just wanted to say, as a thought-stopping technique, I don't think you can get a better one than "it is finished."
There was that fear of leaving. If we left the Trinity Foundation, we were leaving God. Because we were the only ones that really understood, the only ones that had the key to the mystery of God. We were the only ones that really got it. The rest of you in churches, and especially evangelical churches, y'all really didn't understand what Christianity was all about. Because it was only in community that you could learn to be a part of the body of Christ. So if you left, then you left the body of Christ. Not only leaving God, but people were told things like, if you left, your marriage was going to fall apart. Your children were going to fall apart.
God was going to kill your dog.
Your dog was going to be killed. Because God would do anything at all, including killing your dog, you know, to break you so that you would return to the body of Christ. Some of the issues that we're facing former members when they leave, and we're getting into the meat of our presentation now, and I'm glad there's so many seminary students here because y'all will, I know, have the opportunity to minister. Y'all will have opportunities to minister to people that have been involved in spiritually abusive cultic groups. There's an intense loneliness that comes after you leave a group. I see Cynthia's smiling. It's just intense. When we first left Trinity Foundation, Doug was working during the day. He went back to school to work on his master's, so he was gone during the evenings. When I came home from work, you know, I was like, what am I going to do with myself? And in fact, I called a former member. I'm like, what do people do when they're not going to Bible study all the time? What do they do with themselves? Because I did not know. I was very, very lonely. Also, the shattered trust. The trust in God is gone. Your trust in other people. Your trust in yourself. It's shattered. Very, very scared of other Christians. Very scared to go to churches. We'll be the ones that are sitting at the back of the church that we're going to try to slip out before anybody notices us. We're not going to fill out the visitor card, I can guarantee you. We're going to hike it out as soon as we get the opportunity. And there's depression and difficulty making decisions. And there's all those cult-related fears. There's that shame, that guilt, not being able to have made it. I only recall people that left the almost disciples. We had a lot of shame about not being able to make it. And then we weren't elite no more. We weren't elite anymore. That's Dr. Margaret Singer's term. You lose that uniqueness, that specialness. At one point we were a part of a special mission. Now we had nothing. We were nothing.
Okay. There are a lot of losses that former members are dealing with, and as you're ministering to them, you might keep this in mind. Big one, of course, is loss of time and opportunities. I've actually worked for the group for 11 years, so that's 11 years taken out of my career that it's time I can't get back. So I'm back in the career world. I have a job. I'm doing fine, but I'm almost 50 years old, and I'm not anywhere close to the level that I probably would have been at if I hadn't taken those 11 years out. Loss of a sense of family. We were very close to the other people there in the group. I mean, I had been there at the birth of their children, at the hospital. They were there when my children were born. So, there's a very close relationship. I dare say, I don't know, we have friends now, but we're not as close, and sure don't see them as often as we were to the people in the cult. Loss of spirituality. A lot of the former members of Trinity Foundation, and I think this is true of a lot of Bible-based cults, have really just given up on God. Whatever, we'll just be agnostic. Wendy writes in her book a lot about our struggles to find our way back into the church and find our way back to God. It isn't easy. It isn't easy.
And many of the former members that we are acquainted with were not able to reconnect with God. And they would say things like, I don't know what to believe. I don't know what I believe. I can't go to church. I can't read my Bible. I said, if whoever sees a cross, then he wants to destroy it. So obviously a trigger for him.
So, you lose the group structure, you lose the relationships, you lose the trust and innocence, and as Wendy's mentioned, you lose that sense of being a member of the elite, because we were the hardcore.
What former members need?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, education about their cult experience. You understand the dynamics of cult conversion, understand, what kept you from leaving before you did. I think it's Stephen Hassan that has that saying that's great, that nobody really decides to join a cult, they just put off the decision to leave. And so it's important to understand the things that kept you there. There are cult-induced phobias. I think Wendy touched on that they give you the fear that if you leave, your marriage is going to fail, or that your health will fail, or that you'll be an almost disciple and won't be one of the elect, and you'll slide back in and lose your salvation. And of course, our cult leader was very good at pointing at the people who had left, who had bad things happen to them, and he'd say, see what happens, a support system. I'm a licensed counselor now, so, I believe in that. But it's important, as Paul Martin points out, to find a counselor who understands something about cult dynamics. We were so fortunate when we left, and it wasn't through any merit, but we stumbled into a really good counselor. I had gone to a Presbyterian church, and they had a counseling center there associated with the church. So, we got a counselor who was a believer. She didn't understand much about cults initially, but she was willing to be educated, and we would bring her articles.
It's like, here, read this, read this one.
By Paul Martin, usually. And she was willing to learn, and she had a background. She had dealt a lot with battered women and people coming out of abusive relationships, so she was able to kind of generally understand the principle of how to deal with people who have been abused, and so that she was very helpful.
Former members also need hope. Doug and I started a support group for former members of cults and spiritually abusive groups, and at the last meeting I told them that we were doing this presentation. I said, what would y'all tell, what would you have us tell folks how to minister to you? What worked for you? And one lady said that when she left Trinity Foundation, she was a former Trinity Foundation person. When she left, she went to a minister, and one of the things that he said to her was, you can trust your mind. And obviously because of her background, she really grabbed hold of that, and she thought, yes, I can trust myself. Because once you begin to trust yourself again, your instincts, then you can begin trusting other people, and then you can trusting God. So give them that hope that they can trust themselves. Give them that hope that recovery is possible. There is life after the cult. And give them a safe place to tell their story, to heal and tell their story.
Now, in order to help former cult members, a good first step you're already doing, which is to begin to educate yourself about cults in general and the former members' cult in particular. I've got an interesting situation right now. A place where I work, I've got a coworker with whom I have to work very closely. He and I started at the same time, and he's LDS, member of the Latter-day Saints. So I've begun, I didn't know much about that, but I've begun to educate myself about that. Now, I don't know, he hasn't asked me for help, and I don't know that he ever will, but but I mean, if the conversation comes up, I want to know something about the Mormon Church. Provide information about abusive groups, help get them to start, thinking critically about their own group, see if there's any, comparisons that they can make between what's abusive in other groups and what's abusive in his own group. People don't leave a group because they become disaffected with the doctrine. And you're not going to be able, I think I'm probably saying this out of order, but you're not going to be able to, pull a Bible out in most cases and say, see how your group is wrong. I mean, that isn't it. But if they begin to understand that the practices of their group are abusive in some way, that does communicate to people. It's the practices more than the doctrine that are going to cause somebody to actually leave a group. If somebody is in the process of leaving a group, though, be careful about criticizing the group or the leader. I mean, you've got to draw it out of them rather than just saying, well, that guy's a cult leader, and everybody that's there is just a mindless robot.
Well, just back, I thought of something that that,
Wendy, sorry.
Move over just a little bit.
One thing that I remember when we were at Trinity Foundation, people would say to me now, help me understand why your church, your leader has to approve of y'all getting married, because, you know, when you get, y'all not kids, and y'all been dating for an awful long time now. Why is it that they have to approve and give you a blessing? And I was like, well, you just don't understand, because marriages are for the body of Christ. You know, I go through the whole Trinity thing, but those doubts did start seeping in. You know, because I'm going to start thinking, now, wait a second, why does he get to control that? So, you know, asking those questions does help people, even if it's not an immediate reaction. You know, it starts to be planted in their minds.
Okay, you want to encourage the former member to begin trusting himself. I mean, that's the issue, because the cultist taught him not to trust himself. So, I mean, that is so powerful when you tell somebody, you know, you can think for yourself. You know, it's okay. You can trust your instincts. Basically, just providing moral support and understanding, a lot of listening, encouraging involvement in support groups. Wendy and I have now started a support group in Dallas, so if they happen to be in Dallas, you can come up. And you know, have patience. As I mentioned, I was there continuously from the time I was 21 to the time I was 42. You know, I've been out 7 years roughly, I guess. So, you know, I've got a 21-year involvement and 7 years of time of healing. I'm not done yet. I mean, I can tell you I'm still healing in a lot of ways. So it's taking time. And, you know, the people at our church that we attend now have been so patient with us. I can't believe how patient they've been. So, and it's been wonderful.
One of the key aspects of all religious cults, all Bible-based cults, they distort the character of God and use a perverted view of God to command obedience and promote their ideology. Our particular cult taught that God hated you. And
Did y'all catch that? God hates you.
God does not love you. And he only loves the bride, the body of Christ. So he only loves you if you're part of that body of Christ. He does not love you as an individual. He hates you. He hates your individuality. He hates you. And that was talked about over and over and over again. So when we come out of the Trinity Foundation, that's what I believe. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, I had a group in Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and I was a Christian. I knew the Bible, and when I first started going to Trinity Foundation, I called several cult awareness groups, like a good Southern Baptist would do. I called several cult awareness groups and said, "Have you ever heard of this Trinity Foundation?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we've heard of it. We don't classify them as a cult. They're eccentric, but we don't classify them as a cult." I got their doctrinal statements and looked over that, and it just looked like mainstream Christianity. And when the first Bible study that I attended, there were other Southern Baptists there. There was a man that worked for the Baptist Standard, which is the Texas newspaper. Several of them had graduated from Waco, so I thought, here's all these Baptists, surely I'm safe. But you know, I sat there in the Bible studies and I would think, I don't believe what they believe. But I like these people, and I kind of like that too. And so I studied. And gradually, over the 7 years that I was there, I began to believe it. I was indoctrinated, I was brainwashed, and whatever term you want to use. I became a believer in the doctrine. Some common questions from Ex Cultists are, where was God? You know, why did God allow me to join? Why didn't God help me? Where is God now? Is there a loving God? All these questions from former members just, you know, they occupy all of their thoughts. Is, you know, trying to figure out who God is. One of the former members of our group, I had written her something in the email, and she wrote back and she said, but to know a loving God. And, you know, it just still, it just touches me that, that's what she wanted, was to know a loving God. Because at Trinity Foundation, we didn't have a loving God.
No, just to be fair, Trinity Foundation would say, oh, yeah, we believe in a loving God, but, God loves the bride, not you. So, He loved the part of you that was enmeshed with the group, but the part of you that had your own thoughts and ideas and whatever, you didn't care about that. How you can help, you want to reassure people that God does not abandon them. That's so key. I think I'll tell my little story here. When we left, Wendy was going around to different churches and trying to find another place to go, and I really kind of wasn't going at all. All I knew was I felt like I couldn't go back to an evangelical church because Ole had heaped so much scorn on the evangelical churches that I didn't think God was there. So I did tell her that I would try, and I don't even know where I came up with this, but I told her that I would try something kind of different, a more liturgical church. And so we went to an Episcopal church, where we still are. And the Episcopal service, it's very ordered and liturgical, and people kneel and stand up and do all kinds of stuff. And we didn't, we went to an early service. There weren't many people there, and we didn't really know how to do everything and where they were in the prayer book and stuff like that. So I'm sure we stuck out as a sore thumb, but then it came to the part where they have communion, because in the Episcopal Church you have communion every week, and everybody goes down to the front, kneels at the altar, and the priest comes around and gives the communion. And we just stood back in the pews and didn't go up front for the Eucharist, and so the priest actually comes out from behind the altar rail and says, "Wouldn't you like to come and have communion with us?" And we said, well, we didn't know it was okay. We're not members of this church, which was pretty obvious since we didn't know anything. But he said, we invite all baptized Christians to have communion with us. And so I went down and took communion, and it was it was one of the most powerful experiences of my entire life, because I felt like God was reaching back to me at that moment, that He had not abandoned me. And for a long time I couldn't tell about it without crying. I'm getting better, but it was just huge. That spiritual authority, represented by the priest, was reaching back to me and saying, it's okay. There's still a way back to God. And I don't know how we. I just think it was God. I just think it was providence that we found that church, and that happened to us at that point, because there was little chance of me going back to church. Wendy talked me into going to this church just because I had an early service and I could get done, but so that was a big deal. But I had to, something had to happen to tell me that God had not abandoned me. And of course, there's the fear of being manipulated again. As Wendy talked about it. Even as we began to get involved with this Episcopal church, we were very, very slow at first, and we just go to church and leave, and didn't want to have much to do with people there. It's getting better now. But you want to understand that person is going to have a lot of fear of trusting others, and so honors are boundaries. This priest in the church that we went to, they were good about that. They were very respectful, and just gave us time. You want to affirm them, encourage their efforts at problem solving and making their own decisions, because that's going to be hard for them at first. And this is huge. Recognize that anger is a part of the healing process. A lot of times Christians are afraid of anger. We try to stifle anger. But anger is a necessary and natural part of the healing process.
In Recovery from Cults, one of the chapters talks about that healing aspect of anger. that emerging anger is one of the first signs of recovery from the cult experience. It's a normal, healthy reaction, and it's often the most appropriate response. And here's a quote from Tom Martin.
Yeah.
When I read this article and saw this, I felt such a sense of relief, because when I read this article, and I forget which one, I think it was Post-Cult Assessment or Recovery or something. Sorry, I didn't reference the article, but I was going through my anger stage. I was so angry. I can't tell you how angry I was. There were so many times I wanted just to get in my car and drive over to the block and punch over. There were so many times I wanted to punch him.
You did drive over.
Well, I did one time, and I didn't mention. The quote is that it's vital that ex-members' moral outrage not be treated as pathological. The job of being free and the rage that comes with understanding what happened serve to clean the human spirituality. These feelings must run their course, and at this point, recovery to post-cult life begins. So it is okay to be angry. And in fact, it's part of the recovery process.
It's appropriate to be angry.
And it's appropriate, and it's healthy, and it's all those things.
These are our suggestions to the former members. Find a way to stay connected to God. That's a big one, and it's hard. It's hard for people, because the natural thing is that, and especially in a Bible-based cult, you see the Bible as, part of the instrument of what's been used to abuse you and beat you down, and you can lump all that stuff together. All I know is religious people have been the ones that have hurt me, so I just don't want anything to do with the whole thing. That's a very common thing with former cult members. So you have to be very understanding. But to any former cult member, I will still say, in the long run, yes, find a way to stay connected to God. It's absolutely vital. But you might consider attending a church opposite in personality and style from the group you were in. We're Episcopalians now. That works for us. It's very, very different than what Trinity was like. But
I would like to be Baptist again, but this is part of our spiritual journey, and it's where we were able to heal. So, when we didn't know what we were doing, we did the right thing. Providentially, I believe that God definitely was in that. But after we started reading some of the cult literature, that was one of the suggestions. Consider joining or attending a church opposite.
Use a different translation of the Bible. At Trinity Foundation, we used the King James. It was all King James all the time. And no, I love the King James. The poetic language. I really do. But I can't read the King James without hearing it in Oldie's voice. So the King James is lost to me. I basically use the new RSV now. And I've been able to, it took a while, but I've been able to get back into Bible study now. But I do have to do something besides the King James. Of course, I think we're hitting this over and over, but it's important to realize that healing takes time. And understanding triggers. Wendy and I were both probably were guilty of triggering each other without knowing it at times. But one thing that happened that triggered me, I'll tell that story. When she was writing the book, she was delving into her researching back into the doctrine. Got a chapter on the doctrine. And she, Oldie's got a lot of the Bible study tapes, Bible studies on tape, and so she'd be listening to a Bible study by Oldie on tape. And I'd be somewhere else, and I'd come home, and there, here, 3 years out of the cult, I'd come home, and there's Oldie's voice on tape in my house. And that would trigger me. It
didn't bother me for some reason.
But that bothered me, so we had to make a deal that she wouldn't listen to those tapes while I was home.
One of my triggers was every time I would go to church, anytime that Amazing Grace was sung in our church, I would just cry and start sobbing, and I would be very embarrassed. I didn't know what triggers were at the time, and I would just start crying. And I was very embarrassed, but I learned about triggers and realized that the Amazing Grace was triggering me because it was one of Oldie's favorite songs. So every time I heard it, it would just, I'd have that flood of memories. And, but one of the things I tell you about triggers is that, eventually you have to desensitize yourself to them. And that's part of that healing process. I can now listen to Amazing Grace, and sometimes I can even sing it. Probably the first several years, I would cry every time.
Yeah.
And, luckily we had a church, and they would see me crying. They didn't, I cried all the time, so they weren't like,
Big body. I guess I need to desensitize myself a little bit. The steps in ministering to people, and the order is important here, is first and foremost, you want to provide safe harbor for them. So, that was what that church that we're a part of now did for us. They were a safe harbor. And then over time, you develop a relationship with the people. And then, but only then, only when you have established yourself as being trustworthy and respectful of somebody's boundaries and safe, then you can begin to help with the doctrinal issues.
Because that is part of the healing process. They need to sort through the doctrine. But that is the last step. That's what we believe. There are some ministry myths that we'd like to go over. Some people believe that if they know their Bible, I can help someone else out of a cult.
Yeah. You want me to tell about that call we got? A friend of mine who's still at Trinity Foundation has married a woman who apparently is still a Southern Baptist. I think after the fiasco of us, Trinity relaxed their marriage rules quite a bit. But anyway, so he got married, and I think they've got a deal where he goes to Sunday school with her on Sunday morning, and she goes with him to Trinity Foundation Sunday night. So we get a call from her Sunday school teacher, teaches at a Sunday school class at First Baptist in Dallas. And, he's like, I've got this couple in my class, and she's asked me for help with her husband. What is it that he's a member of Trinity Foundation? What is it that he believes? Now, this man that called us, very smart, educated man. I mean, he already has a seminary degree. He's been a missionary. He's a very, scholarly and well-qualified person to deal with biblical issues. But we were trying to explain to him, it's not about the doctrine. You're not going to sit down with this fella and open up a Bible and talk him out of his now 25-year commitment to Trinity Foundation.
Just through Scripture.
It can't happen. And so, we did provide him some information, so that he would, kind of understand where we think the doctrine is askew. But it's going to take more than that to get this guy to exit Trinity Foundation. Former cult members are not biblical illiterates. Wendy had a degree from seminary. I had been, in a lot of evangelical stuff before getting into Trinity Foundation. I was involved in the Navigators. Wow, I had scriptures memorized, and so we weren't biblical illiterates. And by the time I came out of Trinity Foundation, I'd been in Bible study for many hours every week for 20 years. I knew the King James Bible backwards and forwards. So I was not a biblical illiterate. I had some twisted interpretations, but I knew the words.
Another myth is that ex-members do not have a relationship with God. Many people that are involved in especially the Bible-based cults, do have a relationship with God. Now it's messed up after they've been there in the cult for a while, but it is a relationship with God. And during the last couple months that I was at Trinity Foundation, I decided to go to another Bible study at another church. And I think they were doing a precepts Bible studies. Maybe familiar with the precepts curriculum. And I remember by this time I'd been in Trinity Foundation for 7 years, so my doctrines were all messed up. And during one of the Bible studies, I raised my hand and asked a question. And now looking back on it, it was obvious that I was pretty bad. I would probably sound like a heathen. And but the Bible study teacher started witnessing to me and assumed that I wasn't a Christian, assumed I wasn't a believer, and it just offended me. And I probably, she probably rightfully didn't think I was a Christian from whatever I asked, but it did offend me. And I think it's important to remember that people, most of them that have been involved in cults, all those cults, did have a relationship with God. And if the former member would just forgive, he or she could move on. We heard that one a lot. Just forgive. We'll say something about that in a minute too.
All right. So here's what not to say. And and this one was actually said to us more than once. It just goes to show how important it is to know the Scriptures. Well, we knew the Scriptures, but we met a master manipulator who was able to argue the Scriptures better than us, and probably better than most people. So, it wasn't that. I mean, we had emotional needs that, we were looking to get fulfilled, and that's why we joined the group. It wasn't that we didn't know the Scriptures.
And let me say this, because I know several of y'all are going to youth ministry. On the internet, that great thing called the internet, that you can find everything in the world. I saw a Bible study for youth on cults. And so I'm like, oh, great. So I'm looking through it, and one of the last things that the leader asked them to do is to everybody, bow your head and make a commitment never to join a cult.
Nobody joins a cult. I mean, you don't think it's a cult. You think, these people are Christians that have got it right. If you thought it was a cult, you wouldn't join it.
Another thing to say is, what a waste. We know it was a waste of our life, years of our life, wasted opportunities. We already know that. We're already feeling a lot of guilt and shame about that. So, people may do it, you're such a smart person, what a waste of those years. It may sound like an encouraging statement, if we don't receive it that way.
Just move on. We have a friend who, sadly just got a divorce from her husband, 23 years. We were friends with the couple, but in the divorce, you only get to keep one of them for a friend, so we kept one. And, she was married for 23 years. Then her husband had an affair. And then he tried to hide the money from her, so she couldn't get her fair share in the divorce. I mean, it was just horrible. And so she comes over all the time to just talk about stuff. I mean, it's poor woman's heartbroken. I mean, it's a very sad situation. They have 2 kids. I mean, it's really bad. But, imagine us saying to her, just move on. I mean, she was married for 23 years. She's going to be angry for a while. She's going to be talking about it for a while. So the best thing we can do is just listen.
When I was about 10 years old, my father had a serious accident, had a brain injury, and it changed my family. It totally changed the dynamics of my family, and it was very, very traumatic. As adults, my sisters, I had 3 sisters, my sisters and I, every time we got together, we would talk about it. We would talk about that day that he had that, and he fell off the horse. We would process everything that happened the years after that. He had attempted suicide. When we talked and talked and talked about it, process. And I remember our brother, my oldest sister's husband came in and said, why do y'all always talk about this? Y'all need to move on. And, because he's a man. But what we know now about trauma is, the nature of trauma is that you need to process it. And by talking and processing it, you begin to integrate it, you begin to understand, you begin to heal from it. But it does take time. And so that's not one of those helpful things to say just move on.
Yeah, or you just need to forgive. I mean, same kind of thing.
Or you just need to pray about your anger. That one's not.
That is okay, just a couple of quotes to kind of end it. Forgiving is a journey, sometimes a long one, and we may need some time before we get to the station of complete healing. But the nice thing is that we're being healed en route. So forgiving is a journey.
And we found this quote by Lewis Means, The Importance of Grace, and I just thought it was really neat. He said, grace is the beginning of our healing because it offers the one thing we need most: to be accepted without regard to whether we are acceptable, Grace stands for gift. It is the gift of being accepted before we become acceptable. And so more than anything else, as you minister to people that have been spiritually abused, who have been in cultic situations, giving them that gift of grace is so very important. And thank you for attending our workshop today.
I think,
Any
we've got
questions?
time for a couple of questions. Yes, sir.
I had a question for Wendy. Looking back on your perspective, what were some of the ways that we could prevent people from drifting into cults? Because, like you said, you don't realize it's a cult when you go into it.
Right.
So what is some ways that we can sort of protect the people who are in our ministry from, joining these groups which sound good, but have, because it doesn't seem like they gave you all the weird doctrine at the front end. It seemed like they sort of were, slowly letting you in. How could we, what are some warning signs that you might be in a cult?
Sure.
Dr. Margaret Singer, who wrote the book Cults in Our Midst, said that no one is immune to a cult leader, to a persuasive, manipulative cult leader, if they're caught at a vulnerable time in their life. No one is immune. I had a course on cults in my seminary days, but mostly what they taught in that class was the doctrinal differences between Mormons and it was all about doctrine. So that's what I thought a cult was just about the doctrines. So what, even though one thing that I would do is teach people that cults are not just about doctrines, it's about the practices. What are some of the signs? We talked about some of the warning signs of potentially abusive groups. Giving them some of that information is helpful. Letting them know that all churches are not safe. And I'm sorry to say that. All Bible-based groups are not safe. And I think that awareness will help. But also providing a place where people are accepted in your churches. And I tell is I have been divorced, and so in the Southern Baptist school, that's not okay. So when I would go to churches, or at least it wasn't back in my day, maybe it's okay now. But we were, and I very, 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 very much felt like a second-class citizen. And all I wanted to do was learn more about God and serve Him. But I felt like I wasn't quite as good as everybody else when I was in seminary. And I didn't ever tell anybody my details. Because I was just so ashamed about it. Having places where churches that are accepting is obviously very, very important.
That's a good question.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Oh, that guy behind you.
Oh.
His hand raised.
Could I ask you all to put a couple of them slides back up? They went by before we get the stuff down.
Sure. Sorry. I meant to make handouts in there.
How do we prepare church members for, what's success with cult members? It's cool to think that we can share the gospel with one of the Mormon missionaries that come to the door.
Right.
And maybe one of them would accept Christ, but heaven forbid he does, what do you do with it? By the time he gets back, they've got his stuff in the garbage bag sitting outside the door.
Right.
And he has no home, no family, no means to support anything. Your mission field now becomes your living room.
Right.
How do we prepare, the church members? This is what's going to happen. Are you ready? And who's going to be ready?
Boy, that's a good question. One thing Ole used to say that I still think is probably right, which is you shouldn't share the gospel with anybody that you're not willing to lay your life down for. So, it's not about winning a scriptural debate. It's about Ole's right about that. If you're going to share the gospel with somebody, if it's somebody who would have to leave his whole culture in order to follow what you've given him, maybe you better be ready and willing to take him into your guest room. I don't know.
And we did not go over that. We obviously didn't have time to do that too, but some of your people that are coming out of cults are destitute, and need They need financial assistance, they need vocational assistance. Doug hadn't worked in he worked for the foundation.
Yeah, I worked.
He didn't work out in the real world.
Still making-
So his resume kind of looks funny. So they need vocational help, they need all this kind of help. And by the way, those of y'all who don't know, Dr. Martin, he runs a a residential treatment facility for former cult members and people that have been involved in spiritually abusive places. It's Wellspring, and I think he's got a workshop later on this afternoon. But that's a wonderful place. We've never been there, but we just read a lot about it, and wish we could have taken advantage of that. We left.
Well, yes, sir.
It's more of a comment than a question, but it just seems like, where you talk about what not to say, just, this is ways to move on. It just seems like that is just good counseling principles in general, because I know that there have been times where I've been really angry because of something in my life, and then, people treat me as if, it's like, we'll just get over it, or they're angry at me for being angry. It's like no one actually, or I should say not no one, but very few people actually, took the time to understand and just, let the anger run its course. And I think that's a very good principle.
Exactly.
For anything.
And yes, absolutely. And if you, to whatever degree you can prepare your members to be able to do that, to understand that, people coming out of these situations, they just need to be, pretty much heard and understood. Somebody, patiently sit with them and listen to their story, because they have to tell their story. And they may have to, as Wendy was talking about with her sisters, may have to tell it over and over again until they, get it worked through.
And so we were taught at Trinity Foundation that if we were angry about something, that we were playing the victim. So, I was in a double-bind situation when I went to my anger, because then I could hear Oli saying, well, you're the victim.
Yeah.
And you weren't told your feelings, your anger.
Right, and we were taught at Trinity Foundation we had to forgive instantly.
Yeah.
Well,
Forgiveness was, and you had to, his definition of forgiveness was that if it were to happen again, you would allow that person to do the same thing.
Yeah, well, and you had to defend their right to do that to
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, whatever. It didn't let you process your emotions, and people need to be able to do that.
That's it. Oh.
I just have a comment. We were involved in a cult for about 8 years where we were brainwashed, and the FBI was called, and anyway, we were kidnapped. And we came out of that, and we really couldn't rely on our mind. I guess I'm addressing kind of the point of, you can rely on your mind, because the next cult we got involved in, because of the familiarity, we wanted, to be embraced with love, so we got involved in this kind of intimacy, Jesus is my boyfriend, bridal kind of thing. And so I just think that the pressure to be a part of a church, well, no, the pressure of being a part of a church was so great, and sometimes it's not a safe place. There needs to be a period of time.
Absolutely.
Because you can't really rely on your mind sometimes,
Right.
During that period of time. So just a compliment.
And we did take a little bit of time in between before we went on to the other church. And that's a good point. People do need, they do need some time to decompress after an experience like that. But
And some experts recommend that they take a year off.
we were just at a workshop, I realize we're just in, but up in Omaha for a group of people that were in a Bible-based church up there, and there were a couple of well-known anti-cult experts. Paul Martin would know who they are, but I'm not going to use their names. That were there putting on the workshop for former members of cults, and the lady that was kind of hosting the conference wanted Wendy and I to come and do a little piece about spirituality after a cult, and these other two people didn't want us to do that. They're not Christians. But they said, we tried that doesn't work. It never works. You'll offend somebody. Yes, it's wrong. But see, the thing that a lot of times that non-Christians don't get, with Christians who are involved in Bible-based groups, is that spirituality piece, because I mean, the loss of faith to a Christian believer is a huge thing. And I would ultimately recommend to people that they do get back in church, but you're right. You know, you don't want to push it, but at the same time, I don't know, it's a balance, because you don't want to just never encourage somebody to go back to church, because that's just a huge thing. I mean, I can't imagine if I had completely lost it, and some former members of Trinity Foundation have. So.
One thing I've appreciated is it's funny, you know, the church was after, you know, the lost, going to the mission field, but because of all the cultic, Bible-based and non-Bible-based, the lost now is inside the church in some ways, where it's, you know, it's a new mission field. And because there's a lot of people that I know that just, you know, they love God, and they truly do, and I respect them and trust them, but they won't have anything to do with the church. And I'm not saying they're unsaved, but I'm just saying they have, I call it roadkill.
Right.
We have a lot of roadkill, and it's crucial. It's crucial to reach out and just encourage them. It's not them. And the other thing is, and you brought it up, it's amazing. The first to go is discernment. When you're indoctrinated, as Wendy said, it's discernment. You lose discernment. I mean, I listen to people that are in the cult now, and I say, I used to believe like this, and I say, can't they see? And I say this internally. I don't understand. But they don't discern on their own. And even when people are not encouraged or discouraged to think on their own, they stop thinking on their own.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. People are yearning for acceptance and friendship, and people come sadly from dysfunctional families, and I think Oli became very much a surrogate father figure to me, people are looking for a sense of true family, and that's something that the healthy church ought to be providing, and isn't sometimes, and so so people are vulnerable to cults. But I don't know that there's a magic pill that people have needs, and sophisticated manipulators will always find a way to play on those things. So we just have to be aware of it. Thank y'all. Yeah, y'all have been great.